I'm Grim.
I'm Zolgar. That's Kaiju.
And this is Two Idiots and a Dog, Idiots on Film,
where we explore movies that we love
or think are important for pop culture.
Alright, this week we are doing a classic action movie. We are doing 1999's The Matrix.
So we chose The Matrix for a plethora of reasons, many of them involving pleather.
You just like saying the word plethora.
I also like saying the word pleather. The Matrix is a cultural touchstone that has still defined an entire subset of fandom to this day, to the point where it's infected other fandoms, where you see references to this movie popping up in fan bases for multiple other properties referencing this movie, whether it's in parody or just as an homage. We see it all the time, and I think that makes it one of the biggest cultural touchstones of the late 90s, which is why we had to do it and why it absolutely had to be season 1.
I guess.
We're going to cover a lot of those reasons, but before we do, here's a word from our sponsor.
We don't have any, so instead, have a plug for our artist. Like our logo? We do too.
It was made for us by Tundra Katie Bean. You can find more of her work on her Patreon at patreon.com/Tundra Katie Bean. That's patreon.com/TundraKatieBean.
You can also find a link to that on our Patreon page and our SoundCloud page.
So, The Matrix.
So, let's open this up by saying something that might lose us a few fans, but honestly, if this loses us fans, yeah.
We didn't want you anyway.
I mean, I was going to put it a little bit gentler than that, but yeah. The Matrix is, in fact, a trans allegory. It's definitely visible if you know what you're looking for, and, you know, the Wachowski sisters have come out and said that is how they wrote it.
And we want to be clear about something here. While this is a trans allegory, if you yourself watch it and didn't see that story, didn't see that allegory, or it doesn't resonate with you, there's a difference between that and stating that this allegory doesn't exist. If you're in that latter camp, you are wrong.
And yeah, you are wrong. Take that from both the cis and queer person on this podcast. We both saw it. So that out of the way, if you're still with us, apparently you are at least a halfway decent human being. Assuming you're human.
Are any of us human?
What is human?
Anyway. So I think we're going to just use that to segue into some of the theming of the movie first. We're going to touch on several elements of the film as we talk here, but the general themes of the story and cinematography and references that they make are a part of what really make this movie. There is this overwhelming theme of what is real, and in this instance, it could be what is real world or what is real self. Both of those elements are explored a little bit in this movie, and we see this in some of the references they make as well. We see multiple references to The Wizard of Oz. We see multiple references to
Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland, yeah, is another big one. And those themes echo throughout to really, like, the story itself is a trans allegory, but it's also the hero's journey to find himself. And we see this repeatedly come up, and it isn't until Neo, our protagonist, starts really believing and knowing himself that we start seeing him start to actually become the one. It isn't until after the hallway and the element that we'll touch on later that he actually becomes the one and embraces it and can start doing all the really cool the one super stuff. But because the hero's journey to find oneself is so right next door to the trans experience of finding yourself, picking your own name, determining who and what you are, it's really easy to not see it, and that was kind of the point, because this was the 90s and they needed this to be subtle.
Yeah, they made it subtle enough that, you know, even people who have lived that experience, if they aren't told, hey, this is how we meant it, a lot of them missed it.
Yeah, I am genderqueer. I haven't undergone any kind of, full disclosure here, I haven't undergone any kind of like transitional steps or anything, but the name I go by is not the name I was given at birth. I do not identify as the gender I was assigned at birth. I missed this. Now, going back, having heard the Wachowskis confirm this and going back and rewatching the movie recently, yes, it's absolutely there, but I still missed it. And I'm kind of kicking myself a little bit over it because there's one scene in particular that should have nailed it home for me, and that is the train scene where he goes, "My name is Neo," after being called Mr. Anderson for the entire movie. Which brought up an intriguing point you mentioned about the fact that Smith calls everybody by their assigned name.
Except for Morpheus.
Now, we've had a little back and forth on this. I am of the opinion it makes sense he would refer to Morpheus as Morpheus to people who only have known Morpheus as Morpheus, just so they know who he's talking about. And then, for brevity in the movie, they don't expound on that. However, that's not the only person he brings up that name with.
Yeah, he also does specifically refer to Morpheus as Morpheus to his face in the interrogation scene.
Which is very true. Now, I have of the opinion, thinking back on it after you pointed that out earlier, that his delivery was almost a little sardonic or sarcastic, but it's hard to tell because Hugo Weaving did a great job of delivering all of his lines with just that deadpan government drone voice.
Yeah, Hugo Weaving is amazing in that role.
He really needs to be in more things. He was, honestly, most of the cast did great.
Yeah, I don't think anyone in the cast did not play their role well.
Yeah. So these themes of are you awake or not play out, like even in the interrogation scene where things, that was our first real clue, something is not right. Like the scene with the computer, knock knock, follow the white rabbit, all that stuff was a little weird, but could absolutely have been done by somebody just watching and hacking.
That is not where we are first introduced to the concept that the laws of reality need not apply. Because this movie jumps us right into the action. It's one of those movies that that hits us with a burst of action before we get to the meat of the story.
That is true.
And Trinity absolutely violates the laws of physics.
That's true. And you're absolutely correct. I stand corrected because I even in my own notes here, that's impossible, from the cops. That really was our first glimpse that things aren't what they seem. Now, Smith and Neo in the interrogation room, that's where we start learning that things aren't what they seem, but that they aren't okay.
That's when we learn that that we know that the laws of reality don't entirely apply, but this is where we learn that things are just, they can go batshit crazy.
They can. And we have absolutely learned that our antagonist, Mr. Smith and his cohorts, are... Well, I'm going to say something that you're going to object to, and I'm going to ask you to hold your objection for the final talking point. That our antagonists are, in fact, the bad guys.
Oh, I don't disagree with that at all.
Yeah.
I just say there are no good guys.
Yeah, we'll touch back on that on our final talking point, because Zolgar does raise some really good points on that, but we're going to save that for the finale. I word good. Remember, we're professionals.
Are we? Are we really?
God, I don't even know anymore.
I do want to point one thing out really quick about the agents.
Yeah.
They are idiots.
Oh, totally.
Which, that does kind of go into something I mentioned a little bit in our notes section, that especially in action movies, the antagonist almost always has to be a little bit stupid, because if it was smart, the heroes could never win.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, we start to see just a little glimmer of them being smart enough in the final chase sequence, where everybody he meets turns into an agent. Why weren't they doing that the whole movie?
And when we know the line that they had was tapped, and they tell him exactly where to go, and Smith meets him right there.
Yeah.
Why
was this not the plan all along? Yeah, the agents really aren't that smart, but as you stated, they kind of sort of have to be a little dumb, otherwise our heroes aren't going to win the day, because then our heroes have to be smarter even still, and at that point, writing becomes a challenge, and that's coming from the perspective of someone who is also a writer.
Yeah. Writing intelligent antagonists is tricky sometimes.
It is. Real quick, speaking of stupid, I brought this up earlier when we were discussing this, but the resistance movement does everything so subtle and underground. And I'm just sitting there going, like, if your goal is to free as many minds as possible, why aren't you just doing a little bit of splash? I'm not saying, like, actively in the street type of campaign, but, like, spray paint on a wall somewhere, what is the Matrix in big letters, or hack the power grid so downtown skyscrapers spell out the Matrix has you in their windows, or stuff we've seen in other movies. Why aren't they doing that?
Also, if they want to attract, like, the computer hacker types, because back in 1999, the whole thing of hackers being super cool and edgy was really popular in Hollywood. Pro tip, as someone who was alive in 1999, hackers were not cool and edgy. I'm sorry.
Hackers still aren't cool and edgy.
Hackers have never been cool and edgy.
Don't get me wrong, hackers rule the world. To paraphrase a line from another property, Age of the Geek, baby. That's a Leverage reference.
Can't wait till we get to that one.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
So, but also if they're trying to attract, like, the tech geeks, why don't they do things like, let's see, I don't know, random software drops?
Or, like, software piracy cracking. They always have the little text documents, or so I've heard, that are like, we're this crew, and we did that. Why not have one of those? And it's just like, the Matrix has you in that file drop when you go to use a piece of pirated software. Not that we would advocate piracy in any official capacity. Which,
that might be a good place to note that everything we do watch legally.
We do. Just because we don't want to get sued or arrested.
Let's see.
Also, since we just talked about software piracy, can I live in the world where pirating a piece of software or making an illegal program like that earns me $2,000 for one job?
Of course, we don't know how long Neo spent working on that. That could have been a month or more of work.
Still $2,000 more than I currently got.
Well, true. But so back on the topic of the movie, there is the one thing that I noticed that you're hitting yourself for missing.
Yeah.
So kind of back on the subject of the Matrix being a trans allegory. I think this may be one of the last things we bring up about that, but we'll see.
I hate you.
So Morpheus, when he's explaining to Neo what the Matrix is, breaks it down and basically says that it is a prison of our own mind. And as I was watching that scene, I started thinking that, okay, so we're talking about a computer program being the prison of the mind. And what is a computer program?
A string of ones and zeros.
It's binary. So I don't know if this was intentional or not, but you get that moment where you're like, the binary is a prison of the mind.
I hate you.
I know.
I hate you for being the one to realize this.
And for the record, even as the cis person on the cast, I do believe that the binary gender roles are purely a prison of our own devising.
Oh, yeah, no. The binary is a joke. A horrible joke, and we're the punchline.
You are the punchline.
I'm going to punch your line in a minute. All right, so we talk about a lot of the themes here. Speaking of themes, there are several other speeches throughout this film, and they've aged mostly well. There's a few things don't carry over, but a lot of Morpheus' speeches in particular still resonate to this day. You feel that something is wrong, but you don't know what it is. It's like a splinter in your mind. Paraphrased a little. Yeah, those whole speeches about how you are not happy with the world as it is because you feel something in the world is wrong. Decades later, that still resonates.
Unfortunately, that does also really resonate with a particular crowd that... Well, let's not get into that.
As ironic as it is that they keep referencing a set of films made by trans women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they're doing it unironically.
Yeah. Which in and of itself is ironic. But that's enough about that.
Even some of Smith's monologues, his...
Well, there's that speech with Morpheus about classifying us as a species.
That's where I was kind of going, where he talks about calling humans the virus. I think that may have been that may be where Humans Are the Virus comes from in terms of pop culture.
If not be, it sprang up around that time. And while Smith has a few points to it that are right, it has been taken to such a stupid extreme at this point that it's almost parodying itself without trying to.
Yeah, the Humans Are the Virus thing, there are a lot of problems with that mentality. I think it has some points, but that is for a future topic.
Or possibly a different series entirely. We have these themes that to this day are still fairly relevant, packaged in an action platform that I think holds up and you think doesn't.
I'm not going to entirely say it doesn't hold up. It's... The special effects are a little hit or miss to me, but the action sequences, for the most part, are still really strong. There's a couple I think are pretty weak. I really feel like the fight between Smith and Morpheus was... It looked like a video game wrestling match.
It looked like that fight was one-sided, but they tried to make it not seem that way, but Smith had full control of that battle.
And also, it just did not look very good.
Yeah. For me, most of the visual effects have held up. The ones in the Matrix, inside the Matrix itself specifically, to be clear, that don't hold up, in my opinion, still kind of work because it's in a virtual environment and there's going to be glitches and weirdness and so on. There was one element in the real world, visual effects-wise, that didn't hit, and it kind of threw me out for just a moment, and that's when the hovercraft is going through the utility tunnels. The texture on the walls and the tunnels, on the pipes and everything, just hasn't aged well.
All of the CG of the real world just really didn't age very well. The CG on the ship itself, I mean, the ship was a really cool design, but it was...
You're distracted from the ship mostly by the lightning arcs coming off the pylons.
And there's also the Sentinels. Those things, they look like very well done video game monsters.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but considering they're supposed to be real. And the thing of it is, what really made them look that way, thinking back on it, is just the shading was off. If they had been able to shade the textures a little better, and it might have been a limitation of the technology in the 90s. This was 90s CG after all. Yeah, I'll give you that. A lot of the CG in the quote-unquote real world doesn't hold up anymore. And I'm more forgiving of the stuff in the Matrix because it's a digital world and weird glitches are going to happen.
I'm less forgiving of the stuff in the Matrix because I feel that the machines could do better, but at the same time, I'm not going to... I have sat down and watched newer movies with worse special effects and still enjoyed them. So,
yeah,
special effects aren't something that's really that important to me.
Yeah, special effects only really matter to me if they pull me out of the movie. In this case, they didn't really do that as much, so it still works for me.
The only place I think the special effects pulled me out of the movie, honestly, was the scene where Neo's mouth knits itself shut.
Yeah, that one hasn't held up. Even when they shoot to him after it's completely closed, like, they got the coloration just a little off over his mouth.
Yeah, it's just like, that's just, not quite right.
It still works for me because that was inside the Matrix, and a little weirdness is... I'll tolerate it, but I'm not going to say that you're wrong either, you know? So the visuals, I think we can both agree for the most part, are still pretty cool. What they were doing with those visuals was cool. The fact that they made a point of filming the shots, especially inside the Matrix, in such a fashion that we can tell this is not reality. The eponymous bullet time.
I mean, Matrix... If it was not the first movie to do that, which I think it was...
I believe it's what coined the phrase bullet time.
And it's the bullet time and that slow-mo, not quite pause, but like it almost freezes things. Those two things have become so... They've honestly become so overused in cinema, both in places being like, oh, well, that was so cool in The Matrix, we need to copy that. And places like, oh, that's done so much, we've got to make fun of that. The effects that we saw, the bullet time effects, especially, oh man, anytime they do the freeze full 360 thing,
they had to build a special custom camera rig for that. I watched some of the behind the scenes on it, and it was impressive. Like, even by today's filmmaking standards, the rigs they would construct for these shots, they literally had a ring of cameras to get those shots, and then they would splice them together to get that 360 effect. You can do that with one camera now. They make special 360 cameras now that will do that type of thing. But back then, they had to do a rig with like 1 billion cameras to get those shots. It's amazing the extent they went to. And I'm still to this day shocked and happy that the Wachowskis found a studio willing to let them make that costly investment to produce this movie, because the technology needed to be cobbled together to film this movie in the 90s was not cheap.
Yeah, for any issues I may have with this movie now, and I do have some, I will acknowledge that, it has contributed so much to especially the action movie genre, but to movies in general, because they pioneered some of the technology and techniques that are now commonplace. And some of them, yes, they're tropey and overdone now, but others, some of the tricks they used for... But one of my personal favorites, the stupid bullet dodging.
Oh, yeah.
The fact that they had somebody basically, their feet essentially bolted to the floor, and guys in green suits behind them holding green boards and just lowering them backwards.
Yeah. Whether it was the agent or Neo doing the bullet dodges, whether we see the quote-unquote real-time effect where he's blurring all over the place, or the bullet time effect of where we're moving in slow-mo with Neo, which, by the way, I thought was a masterful move regarding audience perception. Like, when we see Neo move like that, we're moving with him in that speed. But when we see the agents move, they're just brr. Agent go burr. I think that was a great directorial choice, and has honestly... It's one of the things that have made me a fan of the Wachowskis since watching this franchise. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the themes and the visuals. A lot of time. But there are a couple of other things I want to touch on real quick. There's all the various themes that we've already talked about. There's a phrase that comes up that I want to touch on, residual self-image. I think as a concept that's really cool, that if we are connected to a digital system, our mind creates this residual self-image of what we think we should look like, from based on our own subconscious and unconscious perceptions of ourselves. I thought that, again, as a concept, was cool. We've got this really cool blend of the sci-fi weirdness and mysticism, prophecies, oracles, etc., which brings us to the Oracle herself and the sequence in the Oracle's apartment. I mean, you've got the kid who acts like he's 1,000 years old.
Which, you gotta give props to Rowan Witt for that.
He was great. He deserved an Oscar for that.
He unfortunately hasn't done a lot since. He's done a few things, but never a major role.
He was amazing. There is no spoon. That kid, that's who we're talking about.
And then, of course, Gloria Foster as the Oracle. She was amazing.
So the Oracle herself, she really brought that character to life. And specifically her interview with Neo was written, directed, and acted out so well. Because I understand the skills that were used. They're used by various real-world psychics and grifters. Those are not necessarily always the same thing, mind you. I'm not starting that discourse. But they use some of the similars to read and direct conversation when they need to. And the fact that, she opens up with the single most honest thing in the movie. Being the one is like being in love. Nobody can tell you are. You just know you are. And then proceeds to guide him through the conversation in such a way that he answers that question for himself. And the whole conversation is her referencing, yourself, the center of self. Know thyself, the Latin phrasing, you pointed that out in the note session. All of that is her guiding him to answer the question himself. Because she already told him, nobody can tell him if he's the one or not. He has to decide that himself. And, of course, the answer he comes up with is, but I'm not the one. And she then gives him the second most honest piece of information she gives him, and that is, you've got the gift, you're waiting for something.
Of course, she also does call him cute and not very bright, which you gotta admit that really defines early Keanu Reeves.
It does. And of course, there's also the mind game she plays with the vase. Oh, it's really going to break your noodle later, as if you would have broken it if I hadn't said anything.
Which, I've got to say, it was a tragic loss for Hollywood that Gloria Foster died in 2001.
It is.
And she was a fairly young woman, unfortunately.
Yeah, she was amazing as the Oracle. I'm so sorry about her passing. I learned about this in the note session. It explains a few things that happen within the franchise, but just learning that such a talent is gone, and that's why the change was made, is unfortunate. And that's most of what I've got going on here. A brief side comment on a couple of things. First of all, the soundtrack was exactly what this movie needed.
It was very much the emo 90 Kids soundtrack.
I hate you.
You just hate me because I'm right.
I hate you. Especially the end song for the end sequence, the use of Rage Against the Machine in that sequence was perfect. And, of course, we can't have a action movie about finding yourself without including the shoehorned in element that must be in all action movies about finding yourself.
The love story.
True love wins the day.
Or, in this case, the power of true love, resurrecting virtual reality Jesus.
I hate you so much.
There is one other thing I want to just touch on briefly before we go into that interesting final conversation. And that is, the humans are a battery thing. The first time I watched it, I was fine with that. But since then, every time I have watched The Matrix, that has bothered me. Humans are not an efficient source of energy. The original concept that the Wachowski sisters put forth for this was that humans were basically ram sticks for the machine. And the studio was like, no, that's too smart for people. And unfortunately, I have to be prone to agree, but it's still...
I work tech support. The general audience is not ready for that.
The we are batteries thing just still... It is something that pulls me out of the movie. It does.
I disagree because they do also comment that it's combined with a form of fusion, so I think it still works, but your perspective is still valid on this. It's all opinion. That's all most of this is. Speaking of opinion, let's get spicy. Go ahead.
Now, when I originally saw this movie, it was probably like right when it came out or shortly after. I don't remember if I saw it in theaters or not because, well, that was more than a week ago, so I don't remember. I loved it. I really did. I was that late teens, early 20s kid in the 90s who was all, oh, edgy, emo, not quite as much as some, and... for those of you not benefiting from the lack of video, Grim is flipping me off right now.
I hate you so much.
But it was still, it's like, oh, this is so cool, this is so bad. Back when bad meant good and whatever.
Language is weird. Slang is weird.
But since then, I have grown up a little bit. I'm still not going to say I'm a full-grown adult, but I have matured some. Some, just a tiny bit. And this movie isn't for me anymore, personally. And a large portion of that is, how do I put this? There was a trend, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, it's still around today, but not as much, of action movie stars not really being good guys, and some of them going so far as going straight up murder hobo, of killing absolutely anybody remotely in their way, regardless of their connection to the actual problem at hand. And Matrix is one of those where our protagonists, I don't want to use the word heroes here, where our protagonists are more than happy to just kill people who have no crime aside from their ignorance of the world they live in. And I understand why that's done, but it bothers me, and especially that lobby fight scene near the end, which, don't get me wrong, that lobby fight scene is amazing. It is aesthetically still one of the greatest mass gun battles I have ever seen.
Even with the machine pistol dropping rifle cartridges.
I will stand by my statement that was a glitch in the Matrix.
To be fair, there was a lot of processing in that building, so I'll give it to you.
But the fact that they were just killing humans who had no idea what was going on, these were military personnel guarding a military building. So they were literally just doing their job, protecting the building from a terrorist threat. And they get gunned down wholesale for it.
I mean, you're, from a purely ethical and moral standpoint, I'm not going to say that you're wrong. I will state, though, that, especially in a situation like that, they are an armed enemy combatant, and it's you or them at that point, and they needed to get Morpheus out. And what were they going to do? Stand there and explain the situation? They'd have been laughed at and then shot. So, I'm not saying you're wrong. I want it to be clear. It's just...
Here's a question. Would Morpheus have wanted that many people killed to rescue him? Not even considering Neo and Trinity risking themselves, but that many effectively innocent minds slain to rescue one man.
Presumably yes, because he never complains about it.
Well, this is a movie.
Yeah. The other factor to bear in mind, and this factor is actually addressed in the movie, any piece of software hardwired into the Matrix is a potential agent. Now, this does loop around to an earlier comment we made about the fact that the agents are stupid, because as soon as they walked into the building, the other 3 guards, other than the one that they immediately gun down, or he kicks, or whatever it is he does to that first guard, should have immediately become agents. Which segues into another interesting point we just kind of stumbled on. We only ever really see 3 agents at a time.
Yeah. Are there only 3 agents? Is it just the 3 programs? Do they have, like, each group of agents has a block of the city they work, or is there some, like, code that limits how many agents can be in one place at a time?
Here's the question. Is there only one city? Are there only 3 agents in every city? Why this arbitrary number? Is it a hard cap? Or is it just self-imposed? That's an intriguing question. Pursuing that question, however, is going to detract from the main point of this current conversation, which is the wholesale slaughter of these people. Like, I understand where you're coming from, but until they're unplugged, every mind in that system is a potential threat. So I understand needing to just, if they get in the way, you mow them down and keep going. And we see this again in that final sequence where everybody Neo runs past turns into an agent.
Just about. There's a few people who don't, but...
Like Phone Guy, Granny with the Knife, all of these people, presumably whoever was already in that hotel room when he opens the door and finds Smith waiting for him, they should have been doing that the whole movie.
They should have.
Admittedly, it did. Saving it for the final sequence made a great cinematic moment.
It just once again shows us that the antagonists are idiots.
Yep.
And the protagonists are evil assholes.
I'm not going to agree with you on that one. Anyway, so that's our take on The Matrix, the greatest trans allegory ever made that involves guns and pleather.
And a pretty decent 1990s action flick.
That's it for this week. Thank you for listening to Two Idiots and a Dog.
If you like what we do, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/TIAAD Media.
That's TIAAD Media, all one word. If you want to send Kaiju fan mail or reach out to the idiots for anything, you can email us at TIAADmedia tiaad@gmail.com.
Again, that is TIAAD media@gmail.com. You can also join us on Discord. Links can be found on Patreon in our email signature and on our SoundCloud page.
We would also like to give a special thank you to all of our patrons on Patreon. If you want to hear your name included here, you can support us at the Honorary Idiot tier on Patreon.